Konstantin Eggert is our Russian Affairs Analyst and joins us from Vilnius now. Konstantin, good to see you. Now, this is, of course, very much still a developing story. What more do we know at this point?
We do know that the Wagner Group headquarters in St. Petersburg lit up the facade of their building with a huge cross, thus indicating that some of their top people died. Speculation is indeed intense as to what happened to the plane. A lot of Russian commentators point to the fact that the plane was shot down not far from Putin's, one of many, Putin's residences in Russia, this time between Moscow and St. Petersburg in the area of Valdai. There, indeed, four S-300 air defense systems are installed to protect Putin. So basically, if it is true that the plane, Prigozhin's plane, was shot down by air defense missiles, it is very difficult to imagine that any kind of major air defense unit could have operated there without full coverage and full knowledge of the Russian armed forces. As to Prigozhin himself, the Russian Aviation Authority published a list of people that were allegedly on the plane, and Prigozhin, as well as Wagner himself, his real name was Dmitry Utkin, the creator, the former officer who created a Wagner Group before Prigozhin took over its financing, was also on board. So it seems that essentially what we used to know as the Wagner Group was, if they're indeed dead, was decapitated by this crash.
Mm-hmm. And what have reactions in Russia been to the crash?
Oh, it's interesting. Some people registered. There are lots of there is lots of video proof to that. That, for example, in a cafe that was frequented by Prigozhin in St. Petersburg, there are flowers heaping up at the doorstep. There is again intense speculation on Russian Telegram channels, on Twitter, everywhere, as to actually whether Prigozhin really was so strange, let us put it like that, as to fly in a plane together with the leadership of the group, i.e., in case something happens, the group will indeed be decapitated, whether Prigozhin could have undertaken this step. But the most interesting thing that we've heard in the last few hours is that it seems that Prigozhin indeed returned from Africa because he wanted to reach out to the Russian military leadership and probably to Putin to counter the move by the GRU, the Russian Defense Ministry of Defense Intelligence Directorate, to take over the whole mercenary business in Africa. If it is indeed so, then probably Prigozhin was quite in a lot of hurry. But again, this is just speculation.
Mm-hmm. It has been exactly 2 months now since that failed mutiny launched by the Wagner mercenary group. Why do you think Prigozhin was allowed to, pretty much carry on as normal after that, presumably, until today?
Well, you see, this is the question of questions, because Putin was seen by many after that, including inside the Russian ruling class, regime, whatever you call it, as actually weak, for first calling this a rebellion and asking the authorities, the army, to nip it in the bud. Then a few hours saying, well, okay, everything fine, we settled the issue. So the main theory is that this is the way the Kremlin got back at Prigozhin, but later. And it's interesting that another commentator, Russian diplomat that defected from Russia last year, Boris Bondarev, said in his Twitter commentary that if you think that this proves strength, then you're wrong. It just tells the future coup plotters, if you really want to achieve something, go all the way. Don't agree to compromises. You can't trust Putin. So I think that this kind of debate is going to continue, and Prigozhin, in some way, will continue to haunt the Russian horizon, because there will still be people saying it was a double, he never died, he disappeared in Africa, he disappeared in the Caribbean. I'm sure that in this respect, this sort of urban legend will go on no matter what really happened to Prigozhin.
And let's talk a little more about that sense of weakness that emerged after that failed mutiny. You cited one commentator there, but Putin very much plays to a domestic audience, doesn't he? So does that fact that he looked so weak after the rebellion, does that change now that the man behind it is presumed dead?
Look, if the main theory behind it, as it is now actually in Russia, is that this was an act of vengeance by Putin, then of course it doesn't end the story of weakness. It doesn't end, to some extent, the story of Putin's unreliability with regard to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of civil servants, bureaucrats that are running the country on his behalf. Because A, he waited for a long time, and B, if it is indeed the Kremlin operation, then the decision to do it in such a strange way, using army air defense on public, it proves that Putin is breaking each and every rule. If it is indeed so, for many people in Russia, especially those who lived through the very turbulent 1990s, it will look more like a mafia killing than basically a political dispute. Frankly speaking, I don't want to sound cynical, but I think you see it all over the Russian social media. People are saying, including leading commentators, that if Prigozhin died in a mysterious car crash or even in a mysterious accident of his airplane, then everyone would have understood, okay, maybe it's score settling, but it's done in a more or less sort of usual way, the way Putin usually operates. He does something, then denies. But this time it's public. And it's very difficult to imagine that anyone can operate an air defense missile within the radius of a few kilometers from Putin's residence with impunity. So I think that this spectacular grotesque of this mysterious crash definitely will give a lot of people a thought whether this is a reliable regime, even, actually speaking, the partisans of this regime.
And we want to dig a little deeper and bring in Brian Whitmore. He's an Atlantic Council Senior Fellow for Russian Politics and joins us from Washington. Good to see you, Mr. Whitmore. U.S. President Joe Biden says he's not surprised by today's events. Are you?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, I expected from the moment that Prigozhin aborted his march on Moscow back in June that he was effectively a dead man walking. I mean, the way you have to look at the way politics works in Russia is to throw out your political science textbooks and read The Godfather, or watch Goodfellas, or watch a couple of seasons of The Sopranos. This is a regime that operates like a crime syndicate. And Putin is the godfather, and Prigozhin was a capo who obviously didn't understand what his place was. And to quote, the immortal character Omar Little from the U.S. television series The Wire, "You come at the king, you best not miss." Well, Prigozhin came at the king, and he missed. And I think this was just a matter of time. And I think it's, with the risk of stating the obvious, I doubt that this was an accident, this plane crash that killed him. So yeah, I am not surprised by this one bit. Putin's famously vindictive. He bided his time, and this is what many of us expected to see sooner or later.
You say Prigozhin came at the king and he missed, but was he really a threat to Putin even after he had left Russia?
Well, I mean, he was a threat to Putin in the sense that if he got away with this, then this can give other people ideas. This is a regime that is largely based on fear. And if you take fear out of the equation, and if Prigozhin can come at the king and get away with it and continue about his business, that set a dangerous precedent. So I think, again, we have to think of the logic of an organized crime syndicate. What happens in an organized crime syndicate when a capo comes at the godfather and is unsuccessful? That capo is not going to be long for this earth. And I think that's effectively what we saw here. So no, he was not an immediate threat to Putin's rule in the sense that he was going to overthrow Putin tomorrow or even wanted to do that. But the fact that he pulled something like this He couldn't get away with this. If he got away with it, that would have damaged the regime's legitimacy.
You wrote very shortly after this failed mutiny that if Prigozhin didn't pay a heavy price, Putin's regime would be in serious danger. Now, it very much looks like he paid the ultimate price. Would you then say that this danger has been averted?
Not necessarily, because I think that what's going on right now has to be looked at in a much, much broader context. The Putin regime is since the invasion of Ukraine 18 months ago, the regime has kind of put itself in a very difficult spot right now because the elite is effectively divided between between very hawkish elements that want nothing short of the complete conquest of Ukraine and a Russian military parade on the Krещатик in central Kyiv. That's not happening. And then those that want to go back to the world as it was before February of 2022, and that's also not happening. So what Putin is giving the elite is pleasing exactly nobody, and that puts the regime in a bit of a precarious position. And this doesn't, and I think the Prigozhin's rebellion was a function of that split that we see in the elite right now. And I think that underlying problem the regime has is not going away. Putin has dealt with the proximate threat, but he has not and cannot deal with the underlying threat.
Moving away from the elites a bit, Prigozhin's supporters have vowed revenge today. How serious a threat is this?
This is something I'm going to be watching very carefully because when Prigozhin was not immediately punished for his rebellion back in June, a lot of us were asking the question, why? Was Putin simply biding his time? That was what I kind of thought, but there were a couple of other hypotheses out there. I talked about a little bit about this on your program yesterday. And one of the theories is that Prigozhin had a lot of support within the elite, within the military, and within the security services and within society. Now, we'll see how this plays out. Putin's clearly just sent a message. We'll see how this plays out going forward, but this is something I'm going to be watching very, very carefully. A couple other things in terms of optics as this played out. General Sergei Surovikin, who is Prigozhin's closest ally in the elite, he was relieved of his command of the Russian Air Force today, the same day as Prigozhin's death. I think that was not an accident. And as the news of the plane crash was breaking, Putin was on television awarding the Hero of Russia award to veterans of the Ukraine war. It's not, nobody missed the coincidence that back in June of last year, Putin gave that same award to Prigozhin. So I think the optics of this were very clearly choreographed to send a message.
Yeah. Now, Wagner has been effectively beheaded. What's likely to happen to the roughly 25,000 fighters in various countries of the world left without command?
This is another one of these known unknowns that we're all going to be watching right now. My understanding is in this plane crash, it wasn't just Prigozhin that was killed, but his right-hand man, Utkin, whose code name in the GRU was Wagner, which gave Wagner its name. He was also, according to at least the initial reports I've read, was among the dead. So Wagner has effectively been decapitated. We will see this could be put in the hands of another Putin-friendly oligarch. Would they be as effective as Prigozhin was in this? It could be disbanded. In a lot of sense, Putin kind of created a Frankenstein monster here with Wagner, and maybe he thinks it's best not to have this going forward. There are other assets that Prigozhin had, like the Troll Farm, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. Prigozhin was part of this, what I call Russia's venture capital foreign policy. This practice of using these nominally private sector entities like Wagner or like the Internet Research Agency to carry out the tasks that the state doesn't want to do as a state. And we'll see how that goes going forward. That's another thing I'm going to be keeping my eye on, and that's an excellent question, and another one of the known unknowns we're looking at right now.
Lots of moving parts at this point. That was Brian Whitmore of the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for your analysis and your time.
Thanks for having me.